So this is a special day for me today. I took the day off of work today, and I have the original Grail Country crew back together again. And we originally, this conversation was just going to be Michael and I, and we were going to kind of like do do a little overview of our impressions of the excellent conversation that Mark Vernon and Jason Baxter just had about C.S. Lewis and Owen Barfield. But really, because I'm just so excited to have us all back together again, I'm very happy to let this conversation go wherever it happens to go. So we might start off as that, using that as a springboard. And Michael is our resident Owen Barfield specialist. I know Barfield pretty well, but Michael is that's really a major area of interest for him. So I'll kind of let Michael start giving his impressions of that conversation and the connection between Lewis and Barfield, and then we'll see where we go.
Yeah, I'll yeah, the conversation, I told you this in a I guess a text, Nate, that it was weird. I was very excited to listen to that, even though in some sense I felt like I didn't learn a lot new about Lewis, but he was weaving together some of these different fragments about Lewis in a way that tells a different story about how the medieval side of Lewis and how the efforts he took to kind of put himself back into that sort of pre-modern consciousness, how deeply that impacted him and his thinking about an understanding of Christianity. And Barfield, in the conversation with Mark Vernon, since he's obviously written about Barfield and knows him really intimately, came up a lot. And one of the things they talked about is how hard Barfield is to read in terms of like how abstract he can make his words in a way that like you're not even sure. Like you can get to the point with Barfield sometimes where you're like, is he saying this is something he's for or against, or is this an app? Like, is this just is he modeling out something that he thinks is wrong, or is he? It's so difficult sometimes with Barfield, but it sounds like Jason's really perhaps interested in maybe even write about Barfield in the future. So I would love, I hope we have a good chance to talk to him about that at some point. And also my first question I had when listening to it was, I was wondering if Jason has read this book, which is one of the first books I read on Barfield. It's called C.S. Lewis's Great War with Owen Barfield. Because I think that book is really seminal in terms of highlighting where C.S. Lewis was at in like say like the early 1920s when he was still like very at an undergraduate level, and where his thinking was and how Barfield influenced him and like where their disagreements were. And it's weird because springing on from there, C.S. Lewis, it's obvious that C.S. Lewis, if you just read anything he wrote about Barfield, he obviously is sort of in awe of Barfield. I mean, at points he says, Barfield, I don't remember who he's writing to, but he's one of his other friends. He says, don't you notice that Barfield towers above us all? And he's talking to like, about Tolkien and the other Inklings. He's like, there's something about Barfield that allows him to not have like everybody had their kind of little specialty in the group, but it was something Barfield, it didn't matter what the specialty was. Barfield had some ability to see, kind of penetrate deeper into it. And I think Barfield's ability there was specifically his emphasis on language. Which both Tolkien and C.S. Lewis take up in their own turns later in terms of influencing how they think about the world and mythology and Christianity. But I don't know. I'm just I just have all these. I don't know if I have a lot interesting to say. I've already read Jason's book. It's if you get it on Audible, you can go through it in like 5 or 6 hours. It's super quick, especially if you're going at like 1.5 or 2x. And again, it's a lot of it is stuff by Lewis. There's lots and lots of quotations from Lewis in the book, kind of analyzing how he thought about certain things and kind of weaving those together in a narrative. But yeah, I'm super interested to hear more about Jason because he talks about this in the book, his book, where he the ways in which our sense of community and participation have diminished. He specifically quotes, I don't know if C.S. Lewis had referenced this, but talking about something written by Wendell Berry about the ways in which, but Wendell Berry specifically points at language and the ways language has changed as a reason for how our communities are broken down. And I feel like that's something we all recognize, but it's really hard to talk about language itself. It's like it's the tool we use to understand and think about everything. So whenever you start trying to talk about it itself, it becomes kind of very difficult to do. And I think that's where Barfield's contribution to all this really shines through. But yeah, that's my scattered ranting on the subject.
That's really good. And I like the sentiment that you started off with, where I didn't feel like I learned a whole lot new. I found this conversation really engaging and exciting. And I would agree with you that I didn't learn a whole lot that was new about Lewis for me, because I was never unaware of Lewis's mystical leanings, nor of how much influence Owen Barfield had on him. But or how deeply Neoplatonic Lewis is. Those are things that were all evident to me. In fact, one of the things I said in response to Mark Vernon on Twitter was that it was actually reading C.S. Lewis's fiction as a child prepared me for reading Plato when I encountered Plato. I felt like I was already prepared to understand Plato because of reading C.S. Lewis's fiction. So this way of thinking, that Platonic way of looking at the world, was something that was instinctive and natural to me. And I think ultimately, like, that's why it was inevitable that I would eventually become a Christian and stay a Christian. I never stopped at any point being essentially Platonist. And I have almost zero interest in philosophy after the Christian Neoplatonic period, because it doesn't actually have any real objections to offer to it and doesn't advance anything. It just misunderstands the Christian Neoplatonic tradition and invents new terms and has less explanatory power. So I didn't learn anything new either. But here's my question. My question is that why are people who are maybe only familiar with Lewis through his apologetic works, or is it just that they're let's say Lewis's more fundamentalist evangelical friends, like the kinds of people that would be resistant to this kind of vision of Lewis, how is it that they don't see it? That's the more interesting question to me, because it's so obvious to me. It's like, I'm wondering, how do they not see it?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is veiled in his fictional writings. You know, I mean, that's my take on it too. I mean, in a lot of ways, you know,
it's not that veiled. He actually has a line. It's all in Plato. What are they teaching kids these days?
Yeah. But still, it's a fictional character that's saying it.
Yeah, that's true.
It's not Lewis himself. There's a lot there, and then it seems like, you know, part of how, I mean, C.S. Lewis, in some real sense, like, you know, the reason why he's able to so effectively communicate with moderns is because in some sense he's very thoroughly modern himself and is aware of it, and he's so even though he's able to kind of do the in his scholarly work, he's always able to kind of put himself into these sort of mental models of the previous ages. I don't think it ever became like, for Barfield, was like, I think Barfield experienced more as like as more of an experience of like seeing more imaginatively, whereas I think for C.S. Lewis, there was always enough of an effort there in terms of his work there that he um it just was different. And I think, also, so I think if we read more of his scholarly works, we'd probably have access to more of that kind of weirdness that Mark and Jason are talking about in their conversation. And or if we have very kind of, I don't know, very strict and literal kind of readings of like the Narnian tales and things like that. Like this is that, like kind of mappings that make it so that we don't see the kind of weirdness he introduces both in the Narnia tales and in the space trilogies. How like he's playing with some really kind of strange ideas there, and the reason he feels safe to do so is because he feels like he's drawing on this sort of like wealth of
He
mythological
does some
tales.
weird things.
Yeah.
Like, let's talk about the space trilogy. Since we're Grail Country, I think we have a contractual obligation to talk about what he does in the space trilogy, because essentially he has a new Arthur and a new Round Table, and suddenly Merlin's showing up in the story.
Mm. I'm
Yeah.
I'm thinking too of the last battle and the Prophet of Tash, which is like blatant perennialism.
Yeah.
In the story where Aslan welcomes the Prophet of Tash, even though the Prophet of Tash says, I wasn't a prophet of yours, I was a right. And Aslan says something like, whatever you did good for Tash, it was done to me,
Right. I don't know if that's necessarily recognition of perennialism. Well, yes and
Well,
no. Yes and no. What it is, what it is, this is a recognition of the centrality of the person of Christ, like the abs, like
sure, but
how
that is a form of Christian perennialism.
I agree.
Yeah.
Because yes.
Okay.
And this is interesting because I just have had a little side conversation going with Julian. Julian reached out to me and was like encouraged me to reach out to Stanley Hauerwas. And he was actually commenting on the little short video I did with Luke where we were actually talking about Christian perennialism, and he was saying that I should have a conversation with Stanley Hauerwas about Christian exclusivism, right? And I think it's interesting that you say this, because I think this is related to this line of thought that I've had going about naming. Like in the conversation that I still haven't released, but will be coming out at some point, where I had like this kind of, I don't know, I want to call it
an epiphany
of sorts about naming and hypostasis. And I think so there's somehow this idea that we have to choose between the absolute particular and the universal is a mistake.
Right.
It's essentially what I'm trying to say in that. And so, and I think this is why Julian wants me to have that conversation with Stanley Hauerwas, because I think that we could probably have a productive conversation that would kind of get to the same sort of synthesis that happened in the very first internet conversation I ever did with me and Michael and Julian, when we were talking about radical orthodoxy. And we were trying very hard to respect Robert Jensen's insistence on the absolute particularity of Christ, and to kind of reconcile that with what some of the radical Orthodox theologians were saying, which was more of this kind of Christian Neoplatonic cosmic Christ image that we're talking about in this conversation today. And I think that there's not an either or. It's like it's a both.
Yeah.
So it's a both, and that and but I would say, here's what I will say in favor of the particularist, right? So and I think Lewis sees this too, which is part of why Lewis is who he is that the universal is always rooted in the particular. Like the particular is the ground. Like if there has to be some particularity for any universal to be grounded in order for it to be a universal.
Yeah. And Jason Baxter's in his book, Jason Baxter has a great quote from C.S. Lewis. I can't remember what work this is from. I think maybe it's a letter he was writing to a friend or something. But he talks about how, in some sense, for every person, like, and I think he there's some language that precedes this that kind of like puts in some like qualifiers and such to, because C.S. Lewis wants to be careful that he's not spouting heterodox opinions, but he says something like, the door we all knock at in God is in some sense ourselves. Like there is the door that we come to in some sense is something very personal to us.
Right, because every hypostasis is in some way contained within the hypostasis of the God man, Jesus Christ. Like that,
Mhm.
like so, and again, it's this oscillation between particularity and universality.
Yeah. And and I think Jason, I don't know if this was in the same passage or if it's elsewhere, but he also talks about how C.S. Lewis, when he talks about morality too, like at a later point, like he's talking about how like he uses the example where Aslan comes to Lucy and he's like basically showing Lucy some of the things that she's done wrong, but it's always done through like in a way such that it's Lucy's own conscience that's kind of accusing her um rather than him coming down as well. And I think that's in that same sort of vein of that there is something, I don't know, exceptionally personal about each of our interactions and understandings of God that is really important and unique. That in some sense, I don't know, has to be saved, has to be redeemed for the all in all to exist.
Let's talk about Aslan for a minute. Let's talk about Aslan, because that's interesting, because a lot of people who say don't care for Lewis's fiction and want to say he was engaging in some sort of like, simplistic allegory, think that he makes it too obvious that Aslan simply is Jesus. But at the same time, let's examine how radical a move it is that Aslan simply is Jesus. Like that's not nothing.
Why is that radical though? Like, what strikes you about that?
What's radical is that
there is that I just wanted to say this, there is that not comparison, but Revelation, the lion and the lamb, right?
mm-hmm.
The lion transforms into the lamb.
Mm-hmm.
So I always understood that representation as Aslan to be kind of derived out of that imagery, but
yeah, of course. But the thing is that here you have Christ that is appearing in a different form,
right? Oh, I see.
Which is a direct challenge. It's a direct challenge to understanding it as, which is why, which brings us back to you're talking about Tash, and clearly indicates the fact that Aslan is Jesus, and the fact that Tash can be forgiven, right? Yeah. Those are not separate concepts.
No, that's right. Yeah. Okay. Right? So I had this thought when Michael was talking about Lewis being like thoroughly modern, right? Actually, I had the thought before that, but then that kind of nailed it for me. Because I always had the impression, as I've grown to understand Barfield better, and George MacDonald, and seen the influence of both of those people on Lewis, that I always got the impression that Lewis was trying to do a service to who he was. Right? He was talking to himself in a sense. Because he, I mean, I think you probably could only actually make really solid arguments to yourself, because you know yourself. Like you don't know your audience, but if you want to just be really integer, you could just sit down and pen something to your old self, so to speak. You know what I mean? And so, like, the Great Divorce is, for me, a really good example of him being really careful about how he frames this for the sake of his old self, right? Because he can already hear his own critique. And he was pretty razor sharp when it came to that, right? So that's kind of, there's my little contribution, you know.
Yeah,
No.
I agree with that. I'd say that he kind of reminds me. I mean, I think, who is it? Paul, Vanderklay has always made comparisons between C.S. Lewis and Peterson, and I think that's where they align. They're kind of like, in certain sense, they're trying to bridge two different worlds, and you know, and because of that bridging of the two worlds, it's almost like there's like two different personalities that can have a conversation, and so like there's a conversational element to Lewis that always makes it easy to understand where he's coming from, because there's like the statement and response, like, and that kind of arguing with oneself, you can kind of feel like like you just said, Sherry, anticipating the critique, and it is very effective in terms of communication, because it's like he'll make some sort of radical statement and then kind of anticipate the modern critique of it, and then try and help make it more palatable or digestible to that modern consciousness. Whereas I'd say Barfield, and this is, I think it's effective to a certain degree, but at some point it's almost like
Barfield loses his audience a little bit.
Yeah, Barfield loses his audience because they're not speaking his language,
right.
but he doesn't. Barfield doesn't really have. It's almost like we need new categories or something, because Barfield's trying to do something actually new, which is like, okay, I don't want to be in the old world. I don't want to be in the medieval world. I don't want to be in the modern world. What we need is a synthesis of the two.
Yeah,
and that's very hard to do. And so, like, I think, it's sort of like, if you're trying to learn a new language and you're always translating back into the old language to get your understanding, you at some point you have to stop doing that, or you can't become fully fluent, right? And I think that's what Barfield's trying to do. And Peterson and both C.S. Lewis are in this translator mode of like a foot in both worlds.
I've got an anthology of quotes that Lewis put together of MacDonald, and he doesn't make any commentary. He titles them, but he makes no commentary, and his silence is actually quite deafening to me in that whole anthology, because for some reason, he doesn't, dare I say, have the courage to say these things himself, but he stands behind MacDonald, who says them for him. And they're all quite radical, really, and mystical in some cases, So yeah, I think Lewis was he was just well aware of the, probably because he was one of them, of the real harsh critique that was going to be hurled his way. And I don't think he was afraid of it. I think he was, like I said before, anticipating it. And
this harsh critique, if you think about both Peterson and C.S. Lewis's biography, C.S. Lewis loses his mom at a really young age, and Jordan Peterson's kind of had this long history of just like struggling with just this sense of the kind of horror of existence that he really, I mean, I feel like it's palpable when he talks about it, that he's talking about with something he kind of really wrestles with. And that seems to be the thing we're still wrestling with, is this sort of like, why does evil need to exist? And both C.S. Lewis and Peterson really seem to have in their own biography a deep experience of that pain and suffering, to the point where there is this sort of doubt, like, could a good God really allow this? And that doubt, it is sort of the modern perspective, period. That's kind of where we are. Yeah, I'm not sure.
Talberg actually reduces it to just that simple formula: that modernity is doubt.
Yeah.
Oh.
essentially.
Mhm. Mhm.
Which is why I was able to say in the conversation we had on the Hangman that Peter was being modern when he stopped believing that he could walk on water.
Mm.
So how do you think this connects to, like, between the differences between Lewis and Barfield? Because Barfield certainly has a clear, I mean, he can be really dark at times in some of his passages. Like he is very clear minded, and aware of the dangers that that modernity presents to
Hmm.
itself. Like if the withdrawal participation follows to its logical limits, which I
I wonder
think
if
is which
yeah.
is interesting, because I think this is why, here's the thing, is like this is what Lewis shows you in his fiction, right? If you wanted to know how bad the withdrawal participation can get, read that
Yeah.
Hideous Strength. Lewis shows it to you. That's
Yeah.
how bad it can get.
Or even the magician
Right,
in the
right,
Narnia Chronicles.
right.
I wanted to ask Michael about the Great War book because I haven't read it. But do you get a sense from that relationship that they had? Because they never became estranged from each other. They remained friends, right?
Hmm.
And so I'm wondering, do you think Lewis is trying to poke holes with his perspective, poke holes in Barfield's ideas, right? Or trying to see if he can poke holes in them, to kind of to test the water, like to see if the bucket can hold the water, you know? So he would just keep flinging his critiques
Hmm.
at Barfield and see how Barfield fields those, right? Whether or not his whole thing crumbles and falls apart. Like, because it seems to me that Lewis would be that kind of person where he would
Yeah.
just keep thinking of, oh, wait, maybe he never thought of this, or whatever.
Well, yeah. I've heard it said, like, of Lewis, that he was like a really good debater, and he would often experience his most cutting doubts right after he won a debate.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Um, because, but yeah, and there was something in relation to that. That with Barfield too. I can't remember the quote now. In relation to this. But I would say, like, C.S. Lewis, when they first met, where he was an atheist, and so was um Barfield, kind of was too. They both came out of World War One, just like, kind of
Traumatized.
traumatized, and just kind of like this sense of, like, the meaninglessness of human existence. But Barfield kind of gets there ahead of other of Lewis, in terms of, like, he has this experience with poetry that he just can't deny, that is some sort of real experience, like something he can't deny, no matter what. Even if philosophically he thinks, everything's meaningless, he, like, engages with poetry and has this experience of a meaning that's so phenomenologically real that he can't deny it. And so he goes off exploring that, and that's what ends up being his two books, history in English words, and poetic diction. um and during that whole time, the letters that are being referenced in this book are being written back and forth. And
Mm.
the things that I think that about the book that have affected me the most is, Barfield's contention that the imagination is a truth-bearing faculty. And and um Lewis he was so thoroughly modern that he thought, you have to have a propositional statement before the word truth can be even applied. It has to be something that can be deducible to a logical, either A or not A,
Mhm.
before you can even ask the truth question. Whereas, like, Barfield sees that something much deeper is happening at a conscious level when we are doing any. I mean, I think he's seeing that there's sort of something fundamental to human consciousness that is a truth merging quality. And yeah, I don't know if that's effective or not. When I was thinking about this the other day, I was thinking about, like, a lot of times, when I'm listening to somebody else talk, and I'm trying to figure out whether they're speaking the truth or not. Like, one of the big things I'm doing to some extent is, this is like an overly simplistic way of saying it, but like, I'm trying to there's certain pattern matching that's going on, to kind of reduce it to very simplistic terms, but like, I'm looking for like large patterns that like are kind of that are in alignment, like that tell me that there's kind of a unity to the structure, that says this is coherent, that this fits together. But then at the other level, I'm looking for, there's a certain level of, I don't know how to describe it. I always use the term weird, which is the term that Mark Vernon uses for his conversation with Jason, talking about the weirdness of Christianity, where and this is why I think whenever somebody's telling their story specifically, there's something about that. There's something about the truth that gleams in a way that it doesn't for anything else. When you're telling your story, like, there's a resonance there where, like, anybody for like miles around, it's like a beam of light. You're like, yeah, that really happened. Like, when she said that, I knew that really happened to her. And I think part of how we know that is there's like, at the broad level, there's, like I was saying, there's like these patterns we all know and recognize, but then there's like these gleams of like something, like it resonates with those larger patterns, but it's also new. It's like you kind of catch your breath, because you're like, I've never heard that before, but I know it's true.
Yeah.
And it's the resonance between that person and what they're saying, and it happened to them. And I don't know how to describe that, but it's sort of like irreducible complexity. Like, it's so new, it can't be fabricated. It's like a diamond. It's like, there's like all this time and pressure and things that went into creating that thing, and it's like nobody else could have said that thing and it would ring true.
Well, this is, well, you've just explained why testimony will always remain like essential part of Christianity. It has to be, right? Because it's someone's personal story of, this is my encounter with Christ. This is how I met him. This is how he met me. This is what he's done for me. This is what this relationship means. Like, I don't think there's any, like, there's no evading the centrality of that.
You know what comes to my mind right now is I watched the conversation with Peterson and Dennis McKenna yesterday on psychedelics. And Peterson asked him if the entities that people meet were real. And Dennis McKenna said something that really I loved. He said, oh wait, now I'm going to forget what it was. Any experience that anyone has is real.
Okay, so Sherry,
I loved that.
So Sherry, I think you'll like this too. So I dropped a link to it in the box. I don't know if you saw it, but I shared it with Michael as well. But someone on Twitter pointed me in the direction of an article written by a man named Joshua Gibbs about whether there will be fictional characters in heaven.
Oh, I saw the link, but I haven't read it yet.
Yeah. So it's really quite delightful. You might want to check it out. But that just makes me.
I kind of chuckled when I saw the title. I was like, oh, I like it.
And it's interesting. I was also talking along that even before I was, well, actually, the reason he linked me the article is that Father Kimmel was involved. There was some discussion on the latest article from his blog, and he was using the author analogy to talk about God, and then someone like made an argument against this because it would represent a kind of hard determinism. And Michael and I have had many conversations about this in the past, but like if you think that's the case, you haven't talked to many writers, because that's not actually how writers think about their work. You know, Dostoevsky had this very much the sense that his characters had autonomy. You know, Tolkien believed that Gondor was a real place.
Yeah, I mean, you read
So-
writers talk about their books, they're constantly waiting to see where it's going to go.
Yeah, I think
Right?
people who aren't writers think it's like, oh, they just made it up and that's all there is to it. And it's
Well,
like
this gets right. This all goes right back to the imaginal, right? And imagination again.
or to even
That's a truth-bearing
right
faculty.
to the imaginal, but
true.
also like even thought. It's like okay, they just made it up, but where do your thoughts come from?
Yeah,
Like
George MacDonald,
that's not really that's actually a far more complicated question than it seems.
George MacDonald has this phrase in one of his essays. I don't know which one it is, the imagination or the fantastic imagination, but he says, and suddenly there your thought stands before you. I just love it. It's true, right? Like, where did it come from?
Which Sam Harris uses as a means that we don't have free will. That's like, he's like, well, you didn't produce it. It's like, yes and no. It's like, yeah, it's a bringing together of these two realities. Like you like you're not choosing it, but you can still say, you can always say no to it. You know,
Well, you have your own thoughts, though.
Yeah.
Like, I'm having them right now, right? I'm drawing on something so that I can say this thing that I want to say, right? Like, I'm having my own thoughts. But
yeah, but in some ways, those are there's something less authentic, I think, almost about. This is a weird thing to say, but when you're consciously aware, like, this is my thought and I am thinking it.
Yeah,
it's almost always somewhat artificial.
Yes, I agree. Yeah. But then, I mean, I can be working away, vacuuming or whatever, and then all of a sudden, ding, there's a thought.
Right.
And it's almost like a gift.
Right, exactly.
It's like,
and
what
it's
are
not
you
the same, and it's very different than the kind of thought that you're like, oh, this is my thought. I'm actively thinking this right now. I'm
like, I wonder, Nate,
I am bringing these data points together from known sources that I definitely have within my memory. Totally different than the kind of thing you're thinking.
That's the problem with scholasticism. But like, this gets to the logical memory, the moral memory, and what we were talking about last time with Michael Martin, right?
Right.
Because, yeah. That was a little bit of a
the logical memory is higher than so let's talk about that, because that challenges what I was just saying to a certain extent.
Sort of
on a certain level.
I mean, the way I understood it, the logical memory is something that you can actually it's a resource, right? It's like a library.
Right. But I would say the kind of thing you're talking about where you have that flash of intuition that just catches you, that is not what Tomberg is talking about when he talks about automatic memory.
No.
Automatic memory it's related to the body.
Yes.
It's really the things that your body, that the fleshly man just does if you don't disrupt its course.
Yeah.
Right. And it's connected to the machine.
Yeah.
Procedural.
Yes, exactly. But the kind of thing you're talking about, where it's just like this flash of intuition comes to you, to me, that has to be connected to vertical or moral memory.
That's the vertical. Yeah.
Because it's like it really feels like it comes from the angels.
Right. It comes from above.
Right.
It comes from above. And that's how I see the imagination.
Yeah.
Like, I'm fully on board with Barfield as the imagination being a truth-bearing faculty. Because I think that it's, well, MacDonald puts it in the terms that, you know, we are in the imagination of God.
Even St. Thomas says that angels only have intuition, like they don't have the same sort of like mechanical like thought process that we do. Nor do spiritual beings see the way we do. Right? For them, seeing and knowing are one act, and all knowledge is intuitive.
But okay, so back to Lewis. So Lewis, as far as I can understand, had a pretty good imagination.
Yes.
Right. So was his war about whether or not that was his own doing, or that it was something that came from outside of him, Michael?
Well, I would say that, like, I don't think he would have written the books he wrote if he wasn't in some sense convinced by Barfield's arguments.
Yeah.
But I don't think he ever propositionally got to the point where he could say confidently what Barfield
Right.
would say, where, like, yeah, this is a truth bearing faculty, that there's,
Yeah.
but I do think, you know,
But he acted as if
yeah,
it was, right, like by using it.
he understood there was things he could say imaginatively that could be communicate things that he couldn't say otherwise. I think
Right.
he definitely understood that.
Yeah.
But you can see that he remains a modern pretty much his whole life, because, like, even after, if you read, like, say, a Greek Observed, you can tell there he's still kind of in the throes of, like, that doubt of, like, um is has this all been just a delusion? Now that the rubber hits the road and I'm experiencing this agony, do I still believe that, all these arguments I've made, do I still believe them?
Yeah.
And for them, it becomes this sort of existential wrestling, that you can witness in that book. Um, and that's, well into, like, late in his life at that point.
But that's like ultimately okay. Let me just this just came to me. Let me see what you would think of this. So Barfield saying that the way to final participation goes through modernity, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if Tomberg is right, and I think he is,
Mm-hmm.
that the essential defining characteristic of modernity is doubt,
Mhm.
then that is the same as to say that the road to final participation must go through doubt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. That's right.
So the so Lewis is just being honest about the struggle,
Yeah.
I think. And I don't know if I would agree that he didn't get there, because why did he write the foreword to Douglas Harding's book?
Yeah.
I think
Well,
he was
getting
curious. I think his profession limited him in some respect, because he had. I mean, I don't. I just think because here's, doubt. If you take it far enough, it's going to lead you to having supersede your faith and reason with something else. And I don't know that.
It's interesting. I'm just thinking this. Sorry for interrupting, but it's interesting because Paul Vanderklay says that whenever he gets into doubt, he reads Miracles. I think it's Miracles, right?
Mhm.
Several times a year he reads, just to get himself back on track. And if my, theory that Lewis is arguing to himself, right? He's writing these books to himself, then his self would be, in a sense, doubtful, because that book seems to quell all the doubts that Paul Vanderklay has, if that makes any sense, what I just said. You know
So
what
you
I'm
think
saying?
Lewis is writing those kinds of works to his own doubting self?
Yes. I do really strongly feel like I haven't read Miracles, but I've read Mere Christianity, and a number of all of the fantasy books and other apologetic books. Can't remember the names of them offhand, and there is a zealotry to his work, right? There's almost like a maniacal, I can almost see a maniacal sweating guy just scribbling these, words down, because he has to put them on paper because he's doubting, and he needs
Well,
to somehow propositionally work it out so that isn't the case for him anymore.
Well, and I don't think it's I think I'm not saying that you're wrong, and that
No, I'm probably wrong.
I'm not saying that you're wrong at all. I know this is what I'm going to say now. I just wanted to make it clear that what I'm about to say is not as a counterpoint.
Sure.
It just maybe an addendum.
Yeah.
But I think that part of his motivation is also, like, particularly as you can see in works like The Abolition of Man and in That Hideous Strength, that he sees the cost
Yeah, yeah.
of giving
Right.
in to that doubt
It-
entirely.
It's cost him, you see.
Right,
It's
right,
cost him, right?
right,
Because he can't fully, he's not Owen Barfield. Like he can't go where Owen is
right.
for some reason,
So,
right? Not fully, anyway.
so I have this theory that then the question is like, if C.S. Lewis is a character in That Hideous Strength himself, like, who is he?
Which one?
So, maybe he identifies with the person who's like tempted to give in entirely. I'm not sure. I
Probably
definitely,
all of those characters.
I mean, he definitely modeled Ransom after
Yes.
Tolkien. That's known, and I think that the Merlin character is kind of it's Charles Williams that he has in
I was
mind.
gonna say, yeah.
I think it's Charles Williams because of Charles Williams' Hermeticism. So he puts, and so he's thinking of Charles Williams a little bit in that character, which is why he kind of has the line scolding Merlin about the lawfulness of what he does, and saying, "Oh, it's okay because it was lawful in your day, but not very lawful even then." So, which kind of like that's that aspect of Lewis that's like, maybe he agrees with the mysticism, but he wants to be careful about it,
Yeah,
kind of thing. Whereas Merlin represents the full-on hermeticist.
right. Yeah,
So,
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I find it kind of beautiful actually that they're all so different. Like,
mm.
and that they remained friends and they forged their own way in the
They
world of,
didn't all like each other, by the way.
yeah, but they
Like,
remained
Tolkien strongly disliked Charles Williams.
Oh, really? I didn't
Yes.
know
Yeah. And actually, Lewis kind of attributed some of Tolkien's disliking of Charles Williams to be simple class prejudice,
that.
because Charles Williams was from not from was from a working class background and mostly self-educated. So,
Interesting.
yeah. Well, Michael's got a hard stop coming up here.
Yeah.
Sounds like we might be. Is there anything else that we want to call attention to before we wrap it?
No, I'll just say that Jason's book is lovely and everybody should read it. If you like C.S. Lewis, it's very good, and yeah, I would highly recommend it.
Let me
Also,
ask let me ask you this, Michael, for people who have read Lewis and might be interested in exploring Barfield, where would you direct them?
Barfield, I always tell people to start with history and English words, because I think you can't understand what Barfield's going on about until you realize that um it's it's language that he's really going on about eventually, because he gets all abstract in later works, and people say they're kind of more to the heart of what he's talking about, but like, if you don't understand that foundational layer about like language that he's so obsessed with, then it all kind of it's difficult to put together.
I I uh I am inclined. This is odd for me because I almost always want to recommend people to go and read an author directly. But in the case of Barfield, I actually, maybe because it was my own pathway into Barfield, I really have to recommend Mark Vernon's book, The Secret History of Christianity. I think he does a really good job of condensing Barfield's ideas in a very easy to understand way.
Mm.
Um, and you will have a very good idea of what Barfield is saying by reading that book, even if you don't read Barfield. And Mark Vernon's book is much easier to understand. being who I am, once Barfield was brought into my consciousness, I had to dive in and read a bunch of Owen Barfield. But I would say that would be a good starting point.
Yeah,
So
Mark's excellent.
yeah,
and so is Mike DeFouche's book on Barfield.
Yeah,
It's more theological and more philosophical, but it's less of a, you have to understand some of those kind of basic terms, or you'll stumble over some of the words, but it's still, it helped me understand Barfield in ways I couldn't before. And then also I would lastly say is a lot of his shorter works are easier, because a lot of those shorter works are like lectures he gave, where he's not assuming any sort of pre-knowledge of and that's really helpful as well.
right. Yeah, because it's the terminology that can become confusing with Barfield. Absolutely. Well, thank you. I'll make sure to put links to all of those in the description. It was good to have this little
Thanks for
OG Grail
inviting me.
Country reunion.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining me today.